Welcome to the show. I am Professor Krebs. This is the Krulltimate Podcast. And this episode in particular is something that I have been chomping at the bit to get to because I get to spend time with a wonderful human being, an incredible philanthropist, someone that I identified with early in my Krull experience, and someone I am honored to call my friend, actor, and incredible humanitarian, Graham McGrath. How you doing, my friend?
Hello, Krebs. Honestly, that was a very, very kind introduction. Thank you.
It is easy with humans like you. First and foremost, let's just, for the sake of those who have not heard us talk before, can you give us sort of the background of how you were introduced to the project, how you came on board in the first place, all sort of like the origin story of how Graham became Titch?
Of course. Well, clearly I was only 10 years old when I made Krull. And what happened to lead up to that moment was I used to attend a speech and drama class after school once a week, including with one of my best friends here in the UK. And one day, an agent came along to see what we were doing and took some of the kids onto her books. And both my friend and I were quite successful in terms of getting some good work. We actually worked together in one of the first TV shows we did. And I did some theatre. And then I made a BBC serialization of Great Expectations. And I was the young Pip. And it seemed that the producers at Columbia Pictures at the time, Ron Silverman and his wife Moira, had seen this on television and kind of wanted to see me for the part of Titch. And that led to being invited to an audition meeting at Pinewood Studios. One bleak, dark evening where my dad got completely lost on the way to the studios. A friend of his had told him it was somewhere up the M1, which, if you know the geography of London, is completely wrong. It's like 12 o'clock going north versus 9 o'clock going west on the orbital system. We got there in the end, slightly late, and had a meeting. And then I landed the part, which was terrific.
And for those who don't know, Pinewood is incredibly famous for an IP or three that was filmed there. How would the average Joe know about Pinewood Studios?
Mostly because of the number of Bond films that came out of the studios, since the 60s, that, Cubby Broccoli built the biggest stage at the time, the 007 stage. And it's still very much there in its a number of iterations because it's burnt down a few times over the years. But the 007 stage, when we were shooting, I hope I'm not jumping the gun here, but
No, not at all.
Was the setting for the Great Swamp, in which the band of travelers on Krull traveled across. Now, the 007 stage was originally built for the Roger Moore film, The Spy Who Loved Me, I think it is. Seeing my Bond knowledge is slipping
Possibly.
this morning. With the submarine.
I've never looked it up. I don't know.
It's the one with the submarines in the ship, anyway. And effectively, inside the hull of the ship with floating submarines is the 007 stage. It's a huge water tank. And so the swamp in Krull was basically a platform built across this whole water tank with various openings for the ponds and the quicksand, with hydraulic lifts below to sort of create a sense of sinking. And so it was actually quite a hazardous place. We were always warned where not to stray, because there would have been, potentially a hole that you drop down and into very deep waters and potentially not get back up again. But yeah, vast set on the 007 stage at Pinewood. All sorts of movies have been shot there. It's expanded massively just in recent years as part of the Pinewood Shepperton group. You have Netflix and Amazon have taken over parts of the studios and invested in the expansions. I'd even filmed there in later life as a young adult for a TV detective drama as well. There's an aura about Pinewood. It's got something about it that, it's very special to be in that environment.
When was the first time that you got to be on the soundstage in that enormous volume of space?
So I think it was, hang on, let's think. The first time on that particular stage, it was when we were the band traveling across the swamp. I guess pretty much chronologically in terms of story. So there was a period of time where everything that needed to be shot on the swamp was shot, obviously, because while that was happening, they were building the next set in another soundstage for another section. I mean, Krull basically took over Pinewood for that production. It was quite extraordinary.
It was such an immense production, and you hear various members of the crew talk about like how they were pressed up against both time and budget to make everything happen. You were 10 years old when all of this was happening. Was there any sort of efforts made to include you into more of the behind the scenes, bigger picture type things like budget and stress and time, or was there more of an effort to like shield you from that because of your age at the time?
My experience even before then was that there was always a degree of pressure and schedule. It, as fun as it was a professional environment. And, also having been at the National Theatre before that and at the Shaftesbury Theatre in London in the West End, I'd become disciplined in terms of, you wait and you wait and you wait, and then you need to be ready and you need to be on. And that's very much the process. So I would, be ready for the point where they're ready to take that shot, having spent hours and hours or days setting something up, and then you have to be on. So it wasn't a case of being shielded from it necessarily. It was just that was just the process of working. I think it's why I enjoy the film stroke movie making process more than anything, because of there's an added layer of intensity, but there's also an amazing amount of focus in terms of what ends up in that frame in that very moment.
Speaking of the swamp scene, as I reflect back on it in my mind, having seen the movie dozens of times at this point in my life, when you had Menno fall into the quicksand, the bandits rally together, Prince Colwyn's calling out, stretch and save him and all this other stuff. We know that the Seer, the Emerald Seer, is put off to the side to sit down, and that's, of course, where he's ambushed by the Changeling. Spoilers, everyone. Do you remember what you were doing as an actor during the chain of helping hands trying to get people out of the quicksand?
Yeah, because we were in a chain, and it was very much a tug of war, if you like. But it was about, I felt I was part of those people trying to save the drowning Menno in the quicksand. That was the thing I loved about acting from a young age, was that being able to step into this moment of whatever you're creating to create a new truth. This is what makes the whole thing come together. It wasn't just about standing there in shot. I was committed to what we were trying to do, and I was also full of admiration for the stunt guys that were doing this stuff. Menno was one of the stunt performers who, spoiler alert, was also a slayer at various points in time. But he was standing on a hydraulic scissor lift, which was underwater. There was about 2 feet worth of chopped up cork and coloured in to match the sand barren sort of stretch of the swamp, and it's incredibly. We did more than one take, and he's having to go under, and ultimately with this hand, and the cameras kept rolling for long periods of time after he was submerged. So it really was exciting and scary and fascinating at the same time. But to answer your question, go back to answer your question, I was there. I was there trying to save him.
Perfect. I'm glad that you included in the chain, and I'm sure if I were a little bit more eagle-eyed and watching the film, I'd see you there. I think a lot of the attention, of course, gets drawn to Colwyn, who's, leading the charge back into the quicksand. One thing that has boiled in my mind, as you and I have talked about Krull over the last year, is there you are at 10 years old, you're being a professional actor amongst a brilliant collection of other British actors and one American, and everyone is acting at a very high professional level. Everyone's an adult but you at the time. Was there ever a point at which you started exploring Titch as a character in terms of like backstory or even future progression of the character, even if it was outside the sort of the frame of the film itself? Were there ways that you breathed life into Titch outside of the script?
Yeah, I think with any sort of character that you're playing, you have to have your backstory for yourself. What you end up seeing, ideally, for any performance is the tip of the iceberg, and all your sort of background prep and whatever brings you to that point of the tip of the iceberg is the character you portray. Everything else is what's under the surface and actually has the impact on what you see. With storytelling in general, whether your performance is playing a musical instrument or whether it's acting, it's all about rehearsal and preparation. And the more that you rehearse and prepare, then the more natural and straightforward the performance is, so that it's then not mechanical. It's as real as possible. That's my approach. For me, it's all about what the performances that I admire the most is when you look at actors and it's almost like they're not doing anything. It's what they're doing when they're listening. No, that's not fair. Not most, but what many actors or what many people think actors are doing is performing every time. Actually, the best performance is coming from reacting. You're listening, you're looking, you're watching, whether there are other characters in the scene or not. It's how your character is reacting to the situation, just to make it authentic as possible.
That's fantastic advice, especially to someone like myself who's an amateur actor and is nowhere on your level. It's nice to hear a little piece of advice to help me get one step closer to being as cool as you. So one question I have, and maybe there's not a good answer to this, and that's fine, but one question I've always had is, even if it's something that you came up with, or maybe it was a story that was explained to you behind the scenes, how did Titch come to be the apprentice of the Emerald Seer?
So this wasn't explained really explicitly. There were, I don't think Peter had a lot of interest in Titch in terms of the story. Because originally Titch wasn't going to survive beyond the swamp. I think he was, originally going to go down with the Seer. But it was the producers that wanted Titch to continue and be part of the small number of survivors, spoiler alert, that make it, beyond the Black Fortress with Princess Lissa saved from the beast. So for me, it was just really having an understanding of this, orphaned child, but being part of a family of oracles, people that were known on planet Krull to be consulted when some wisdom was sought, which, still goes on planet Earth to this day, where people seek answers from those that might have divine insights to things. So that was sort of where I was. And if anything, the closest thing I would relate my relationship to the Seer, Titch's relationship. I say for viewers and listeners, forgive me because I'm talking from Titch's point of view a lot of the time. But my relationship with the Seer was that of a wonderful grandfather, my sage, my tutor, my guide, and would go anywhere with the Seer. There was no question. And that's why when you see everyone first entering the Emerald Grotto, Titch is there on standby, to help and serve. And he is the apprentice, is the Seer's future in terms of carrying on this particular oracle's legacy.
That's a fantastic thing you just pointed out. Is the place where the Emerald Seer is met by Ynir and Torquil and Colwyn and Ergo, is that place officially called the Emerald Grotto, or is that a nickname that you've come up with just to give it a name in space?
That came to my mind just then because I remember it being in one of the versions of the script. It was referred to that way.
I'm not even sure that's how it's referred to in the book, which is, the book is so interesting to me because it's an adaptation of the script and the notes and basically the writers who wrote the script to begin with got to insert a lot of information with Alan Dean Foster that never made it into the film or that wasn't explicitly stated in the film, right? I was curious if that was the official name, and you're saying that in an earlier version of the script that may have been how it was referred to?
It's just another word for a cave, I guess, but for me it had a bit more sort of magic about it. A grotto. Cave.
It's better to say, yeah, it's more ethereal to call something a vale as opposed to like a meadow, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's more poetic, I guess.
Once upon a time, I was watching Krull with a good buddy of mine who is also a Krull fan. And I have, what would it be? I have something like 15 years on him or something like that. Like I'm significantly his senior, but he and I are excellent friends. And we sat down one time when he was visiting and we watched Krull, but we did something we'd never done before. And we plopped in the Blu-ray because it had the best visual fidelity. And we watched the film with remote in hand, and we would pause it and go frame by frame at certain points to analyze what was going on in ways that we hadn't before. We turned a 200-minute movie, an hour and 40-minute movie, into like a 4.5-hour experience. and it was great for us. I think my wife would have other things to say about it. But one of the things that we noticed, it was the first time I ever noticed this, but the Emerald Seer has animals in the grotto. Like everyone wants to talk to you about, oh, you got to hold a sleeping tiger on your lap and things of that nature, right? But there were animals in the Emerald Seer's cave. Do you remember what animals were there when you were shooting?
I am intrigued. I don't recall.
I was stunned too, but it actually kind of makes sense in terms of just like the practicality of living inside of a cave with no perceivable entrance or exit. In the back, where you and David Batley sit to introduce yourselves to each other, there were, if I'm not mistaken, 3. There's at least 2, but I think there are 3 goats in the back of the cave.
Ah, yes.
Do you remember any of the experience of having those animals on the set during that time?
They were, brought in at the last minute, obviously, and position. But the what's so interesting is that when you said the goats, the one thing, what it's like with your sense of smell being very closely linked to memory, is that the Emerald Cave had I always think of the smell. I can think of the smell when we were on different stages, in different places. There was always, certain things. It might even have been the fumes from certain pieces of set that were being painted at the last second, where, just being touched up and decorated, or it might have been the type of surface, for instance, in the forest with the giant trees. That has a particular smell, and if I happen to smell it in nature, it just takes me back to, it's strange, isn't it? So yes, the Emerald Cave did smell of goats.
It did smell of goats, and I imagine I've never had to film with goats. I've filmed with horses before, but I've never filmed with goats, and I imagine that has to be really obnoxious. Like, goats are not known for being really complacent, easy to work with animals. I think that might be why typically they're kept on property with lots of space between houses, because they are loud and obnoxious.
Oh.
Were there any like issues with that? Did any actors struggle with that? Did David Batley have terrible allergies that had to be combated? Like, well, I never thought I'd ask this many questions about goats in Krull, but I am dreadfully curious.
David was not good with animals. I mean, he was terrified of horses. Absolutely terrified.
He was terrified of horses?
Yeah. So when, for instance, when we're rounding up the fire mares and I'm right out there, helping to corral them, David was really very scared, staying back in the protection of this overhang in the cliff. But in terms of the goats, I mean, the one thing that I will say, Krebs, about animals used for film is that the people that work with them are quite incredible in terms of training. I was lucky enough to visit the people that were doing the owls at Leavesden for Harry Potter, probably a decade or so ago now. And I've worked with animal trainers, and it's remarkable that however ignorant you think an animal might be, or how, uncontrollable it might be, through positive reinforcement, I've been amazed at how animals will perform through their own free will. They're not being forced or coerced, but it's just about really, really excellent training. So even then, with the goats, that they were happily distracted by the promise of reward, because that's really what it comes down to. And there was a person, I think, who looked after them, hiding down below that raised section, making sure that they didn't suddenly run off. But you're quite right, though. Goats are not your first choice of animal necessarily you think of. But yeah, they were brought in, taken straight off after each setup, so didn't cause anyone any problems, and David certainly didn't want to go in near them.
David Batley is absolutely on the list of people I wish I'd had a chance to meet in this lifetime. Well, there is a behind the scenes special that can be viewed on the special edition DVD, a fantastic, wonderful piece of television magic from the 80s. In that special, they have a sequence where a lot of the main cast are being brought on for like a cold read, and David Batley is shaking hands with a young boy. And every time I go through that sequence and I watch that over and over again, it is ambiguous as to whether that young boy is actually you or a different little boy. Do you remember if in that television special, if that behind the scenes footage was of you shaking hands with David Batley, or was that somebody else?
Was the boy in a school uniform?
Yes.
Yeah, it was me.
Perfect. I think at that point, then you probably were closer. Were you closer to 9 at that point, or were you still 10 at that point?
No, I would have been 10. So it was in the autumn of the year of me turning 10 in July. Autumn was the auditions and pre-production, and then the read-throughs, and then from January onwards was when we went into production. So yeah, I was already 10. And the read through is which is what you would have seen in that clip, was just when the cast assemble as all engaged on the production. And the read through isn't really to perform necessarily; it's just to get a general flow and for people to sort of register chemistry and things like that. So it's quite a thing when you have everybody around the table at the same time, because it's probably the only time everyone's in the room together. Everything that happens subsequently, generally, not everyone is in the same scene. So, that collective moment at the beginning is quite something.
And there you were around a table with Freddie Jones and Alan Armstrong and a young up-and-comer Liam Neeson and Lisette Anthony and David Batley and all these wonderful human beings, who are incredible actors and performers. What was that like, being in that room with everybody at the same time, with the same purpose, at that scope?
It was awe-inspiring. It was really exciting, and we were in this room in the original main building at Pinewood Studios. Everything had that sense of prestige, and even from the producer's point of view, they had so much belief in this project. So there was a real tangible excitement. And, as you say, some of the people that have subsequently gone on to be, very, very, very successful, such as Liam or Robbie, the late Robbie, they were young and nervous and excited, and at that point in time, Freddie Jones certainly had some real credibility, but there was a real energy, which was absolutely fantastic to be in the room at the table with that group of people. So there's only a few projects that I've been involved with over the years where you have that proper all cast read through, and they are special moments because it's that first colloquium of the people that will bring the story to life.
Switching gears into the mythos of the world and speaking from the point of Krull being a reality as opposed to a fiction, other than Titch, what character story, experience, origin, any of that, what is one or a few of your favorite characters and their origins and where they would go after the film?
Well, that's a good question.
Thank you so very kindly for listening to this episode of the Krulltimate Podcast. And it is given you to know that the second half of this interview is coming next. Until then, I have been your host, Professor Krebs, and this is the Krulltimate Podcast.